Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to be starting our second unit of our Modern Global Issues class, and we are going to be taking a look at a unit called Foundations of Modern Nations. Now, after World War II, we saw the world change tremendously. There were many new independent nations as the age of colonialism started to come to an end. We saw nations that had existed start to break apart. We're going to talk about nations like the former Yugoslavia that broke apart at the end of the Cold War. So there's a lot of struggle as a part of this unit. We're going to see, how the map of today has been created, and some of the different tensions that formed to lead to these new nations being formed, both cultural differences in religion, but also political strife as well. So let's go ahead and jump into our notes here. Foundations of Modern Nations. Oops, skipping ahead. All right, so we do have to go back to World War II to understand where all of this conflict kind of originated. When we talk about the phrase balance of power, what happened in World War II is the old world got completely flipped on its head. What had been the dominant countries in Europe for literally hundreds of years, really in the globe for hundreds of years, now all of a sudden find themselves bankrupt and their cities destroyed by this global war. Now, what emerged was a new war, a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, we talked a little bit about that in our last unit as how the Cold War kind of shaped the world economically as either being capitalist and democratic or communist. But that is a conflict that is going to last until 1991. Almost every event we're going to talk about in this unit takes place in this Cold War umbrella. Sometimes it is directly related to the conflict between the United States and USSR. Other times it is just, it's completely on its own. But it is in the midst of this post-World War II world that we are going to be taking a look at some of the changes that happen. Now, like I said, in the Cold War, there were really two countries that emerged from World War II relatively unscathed industrially. The Soviet Union lost a tremendous, millions upon millions of people in that war. So I don't want to make that callous comment. The United States suffered heavy losses, the second highest losses in any American war ever. But both of those nations, industrially speaking, emerged fairly strong and are known as the two superpowers. So like I said, the Soviet Union is going to have a goal of spreading communism, and they do so by pushing communism in Eastern Europe, whereas the United States is going to try and push for democracy and capitalism throughout the world, which is directly against what the Soviets are wanting. So what we see is that within the first few years of the Cold War, this is what the map starts to look like. You have in blue the NATO countries, and we introduced NATO last unit. The Soviets had their own version of this called the Warsaw Pact. Those are seen there in red. And everybody kind of fell in line with one of those two groups. And for the most part, it was kind of divided, East versus West. So that's kind of where we get that terminology. Now, as the old world powers are starting to decline, and like I said, Britain had been bombed to death. Germany is completely and utterly destroyed. France has been occupied and destroyed over the last, 5 years of fighting. It does have some impacts on how they ran the world. First of all, we're going to see the impact of decolonization. Every one of those nations I just mentioned had vast empires that stretched throughout the globe. Those empires are going to come to an end following World War II. So how do you take a nation that has been under control of one of these European nations, sometimes for hundreds of years, and say all of a sudden now, hey, you're independent, you're on your own. There's no guidance, there's no selection on governments. They kind of have to figure that out on their own, and frankly, it leads to turmoil in many cases. These are three impacts that this decolonization process has had throughout the world. First of all, economic poverty. We see that a lot of newly independent countries, especially, I'm thinking of nations throughout Africa, who have had, their resources taken, quite literally mined and taken for decades and centuries. When they're left on their own, many of them are left with basically zero resources to build off of. So you do have massive poverty after decolonization. Often there's a lot of political instability. We see, again, in African nations in particular, a lot of dictators rise up and, will control things for maybe a few years, and then all of a sudden they get either assassinated or overthrown in another revolution. And so, that political instability, I don't think we appreciate in America how important of a factor that is in terms of political stability, knowing that the laws aren't going to all of a sudden change on us quite drastically, and that we know who the authority figures are. It's not going to change on a day-to-day basis. Thirdly, one of the big impacts we're going to see in these newly independent nations are ethnic disputes. Now, in some cases, these ethnic disputes have always existed, but sometimes, especially in totalitarian societies or societies where you had kind of an autocracy, they had kind of capped those ethnic disputes. In particular, we're going to look at the case of Yugoslavia. For decades, Yugoslavia had been run by a communist ruler, and with an iron fist had kind of ruled over that country. But when he died and the country became independent, a lot of those ethnic disputes rose to the surface, and people wanted to break off and form their own country with their own ethnic group, and it led to a lot of clashing and a lot of violence. So these are going to be some of the biggest impacts we'll see from the decolonization process right after World War II. This whole unit is primarily made up of case studies where we're going to look at specific examples of things that happened in locations around the world and how they were impacted by becoming a newly independent nation. The first one we're going to look at is the whole continent of Africa. Now, I assume you probably know a little bit of the history of Africa, at least since the time of slave trading and whatnot. Basically, starting way back at the time of colonization, you did have a lot of European nations coming into Africa and trying to colonize it for their own. You can see in this map all the different colors. Each color represents a different European nation that was trying to strive for control in Africa. And over the centuries of that control, they're taking resources, both material, mineral, also human resources out of this continent. And competition over land would run extreme in Africa. The scramble for Africa, as it was known, caused Africa to be divided up among a number of European nations. Now, this mainly took place in 1884. There was a conference in Berlin, and it quite literally was a group of white men sitting around a table, dividing up a map of Africa, claiming what they wanted for their own, with little to, well, not little, no impact, no influence from any African leaders or civilians at all. They are deciding the fates of literally millions of people who have, different cultures, have different histories, sometimes warring histories with different groups living relatively close by. And here, 1,000 miles away, you have these Europeans drawing borders and sometimes grouping these people together. It's not going to work out in the long run without any kind of influence from those people in Africa. So this really sets the stage. Berlin Conference, when they start basically assigning borders in Africa, this really sets the stage for the failure, 100 years, 75 years later, when all these Europeans leave. Because after, decades of exploitation, there's, sometimes they would work with a certain ethnic group, and I'm thinking about Rwanda here. The Belgians came in and they worked with the minority group there called the Tutsis. And when the Belgians left, all of a sudden the majority group, the Hutus, wanted revenge against the Tutsis for collaborating with the Belgians for so long, and it led to immediate war and, frankly, a genocide. So we will see that later on. So, the problems of today are rooted in the history of the past here. Now, after World War II, a lot of those European nations gave up their colonies, and many of those were in Africa. And so a lot of African nations start to go through similar struggles. Like I said, one of those struggles is going to be the issue of poverty. For quite literally centuries, resources were being ripped and sold from Africa, with the profits staying in Europe. None of those profits are really being seen back in Africa. So what does that impact have today? Well, today you can see that 87% of Africans live on less than $2 a day. I want you to think about that. I'm guessing there are some of you watching this who have spent more than that, probably on the cup of coffee you're drinking. That is the daily intake for many Africans, less than $2 a day. That is extreme poverty, and that is very difficult to get out of, to end that cycle. And many of them are farmers, so it's not as if they're in an industry that can all of a sudden boom. Now, a big reason for all of this poverty is because many of these nations have taken on tremendous amounts of debt. In our last unit, we looked at some organizations that lent money to very poor nations for either infrastructure or whatnot. Many of these nations still have those loans, and a big chunk of the money the government spends each year is on repaying those debts. Currently, African nations are somewhere in the range of $200 billion with a B in debt. And it's very cyclical, meaning, what you'll have is a government fail, a dictator rise up and take on some loans, some debts to either an organization or another country. They'll buy things like weapons, and then all of a sudden that dictator's gone. They're either dead or there's been another revolution. Well, those debts still remain, and the people are going to have to continue paying for them. Nations take in about $10 billion in aid each year. A lot of money is sent to Africa in aid, but they're having to spend $14 billion a year in debt elimination. This is what they're spending most of their money on, is paying off debt. So when you have things like in the 1980s and 90s, the massive AIDS epidemic that is going to ravage Africa, what we see is that money that could be spent on healthcare is being spent on paying back these global organizations and Western nations for debt relief. One example, in 2003, Zambia was spending 2 times what they were spending on healthcare for debt repayment. This is a big issue. So if we truly want to see change in Africa, one thing that we do need to look at is either some sort of loan forgiveness, or at least minimizing the impact that those debts have, making sure that any new loans that are being taken out by African nations are solid plans that are going to result in either money being paid back or are going to work out for the long run for all parties involved. We cannot keep doing this same thing over and over. Like I said, these nations are not spending as much money as they need to on healthcare, and it is showing. Over 50% of Africans lack access to proper healthcare. In many rural areas, doctors will only show up about once a month if they're lucky. They kind of rotate around. And that's the case in many poor nations throughout the world. I visited Costa Rica a few years ago, and the doctor quite literally would only show up in this village I was staying at once a month. Well, you better hope you don't get drastically sick in that time outside of that month, but there's just not enough resources to pay a doctor to stay in that village long term. Now, again, back to kind of the overall issue of healthcare. Most nations are spending less than 10% of their GDP on healthcare. Nigeria has 1 doctor per 2,000 people, spends 3% of their GDP on healthcare. Again, that's bad enough in and of itself. A lot of unnecessary deaths, people that are dying that if they were living in, frankly, any other continent in the world would be surviving because they had access to healthcare, but they just happened to be born here. Over the last 20 years, AIDS has ripped through Africa, and about 2/3 of all the people living with AIDS in the world today are living in Africa. And again, this is a result of the poverty of Africa, but also the lack of education in Africa. Another basic kind of building block of at least our society. People don't realize often how AIDS is spread, so it spreads more rapidly. You can see there, the further you go south, about 70% are living in sub-Saharan Africa. And, overall, even though we made some tremendous advancements in combating AIDS, ultimately people are living about 20 years less in Africa with AIDS than they are elsewhere. So, again, there's a lot of reasons for that, but ultimately they don't have doctors, they don't have health care, and there's misinformation that gets spread about some of it historically based. Don't let them poke you with a needle. Last time they did this, they were spreading disease, and historically that has occurred before. And by the way, that's actually occurred even in the United States among certain minority populations. So that's a whole nother story. HIV prevalence in adults in 2001. You can see, it's a tremendous difference between, these poverty-ridden nations in Africa than it is the rest of the world. Another sad issue that often is taking place in Africa is the issue of human trafficking. And I appreciate the fact that this topic has garnered more attention over the last few years, but ultimately not much has been done to try and curb these abuses. Human trafficking is the buying and selling of human beings, and most often those, and they are slaves. For the most part, even though sometimes people may pay to be transported across borders or whatnot, ultimately a lot of human trafficking results in slavery. Currently, there are 3.5 million Africans who are being trafficked for labor. They are being used as manual workers, often in Europe. They basically, they don't have enough money to pay to get transported to Europe, so they will actually trade their labor. They'll trade a certain number of years, and as you can imagine, years just kind of compound and multiply, and next thing you know, an entire life is being forced to work to pay off this debt. This original debt. The sex industry, sadly, especially in areas like Southeast Asia, the sex trade is still very strong, and sadly, this is an extremely sad topic. But to make matters even worse, about 50% of those that are being trafficked are children. And I've been witness to this. I've seen children being used in China. You're always kind of getting, kids that are begging for money. And I remember one little kid we saw that just the saddest little kid you've ever seen. Just completely dirty and, hadn't been clean for a very long time, tattered clothing. I remember came up and begged us. We gave him a few coins. He immediately ran back, and we could see he immediately ran back and gave the money to this guy who definitely was not his parent, and he was actually collecting from other kids as well. So I have no doubt that child was basically owned by that person as basically as a slave. So this is prevalent. It does happen. It's extremely sickening that this could happen. I don't believe I have it in the notes, but I did hear a statistic one time that there are actually more slaves in existence today than existed in all of antebellum America. Okay, so what that means is before the Civil War, every slave, if you were to total them up, every slave that ever existed in the United States at a time where slavery was legal here, there are more slaves in existence today. Okay? And many of them, I will tell you, are still operating in the United States. They may not take on the same form as what historical slavery has looked like here, but slavery does exist here. Sometimes they're still used in the fields for manual labor. Other times it's factories. Other times it's restaurants. It takes on massage parlors. It takes on different forms, but slavery still exists. Human trafficking still exists, and Africa is sadly kind of the center point of that. One of the final pieces on Africa we're going to discuss today is the political instability that has affected Africa after independence in the 1950s. Currently, there are 12 nations in Africa that are warring among one another, and there are upwards of 25 million people that have been displaced because of these conflicts. So I'm going to highlight a few of these conflicts, that some of which are continuing on today, but just look at some of these numbers of how many people are killed. And again, you think about if this was happening in a Western nation like the United States, how people would handle this differently. In Liberia, which is a small West African nation, this began in 1989, would continue on and off until 2003. There was a warlord that rose up named Charles Taylor. He had actually been educated in the United States. He lived in America for quite a while, and he went back and basically kind of got a gang of people to rise up and to try and overthrow the government. And the civil war that was sparked ultimately killed 300,000 people. Now, part of that was because it was fueled by weapons, especially in this period. We had the Soviet Union collapse, which spilled a lot of weapons into the general population, and Charles Taylor was buying up weapons left and right. But Liberia would devolve into some ethnic conflicts of different ethnic groups that were trying to vie for resources within Liberia. By the time the conflict would come to an end in 2003, there were upwards of 1 million people that had been killed in that country. That's just one small nation, and it's truly tiny. I would argue it's probably the size of I don't even know. I don't know, maybe Massachusetts. I mean, it's not big at all, but almost 1 million people dying in this conflict, and that's just one example. The second example we'll look at is the Second Congo War. It does imply that there was a first. This was fought up until 2003. This was the second deadliest conflict since World War II. 5.4 million people dead. And I would venture to guess that most people watching this video have never even heard of it. How is that possible that within the last few decades there could be a war that killed millions upon millions of people? For the most part, we don't even know much about it. Ultimately, the United Nations had to get involved and was able to kind of stop some of the fighting there. But like I said, not before over 5 million people lost their lives. Now, what impacts do these wars have on Africa? Well, they just take a impoverished nation and they make it more impoverished. And frankly, there's a lot of negative consequences that come along with that. I mentioned the warlord Charles Taylor earlier. What he relied heavily upon was the use of child soldiers. 40% of the child soldiers that are being used throughout the world are being used in Africa. There are currently child soldiers being used in 10 African nations. Most of those that are in conflict today are using child soldiers. These children are often kidnapped at a very young age, as early as 8 years old, basically old enough to hold a rifle. And many of them are kept there. They are basically kidnapped and they are kept there kind of as slaves. Many of them are injected with drugs against their will to the point where they become addicted. And then they're hooked. They cannot leave because they are drug addicts. It's so amazingly horrible what human beings can do to one another. You think about what you were doing at 8 years old. I'm guessing it was not shooting heroin and holding a Kalashnikov, but that is because you were blessed to grow up in the country that we live in today. And I tell you, we need to make sure we appreciate the stability of our country, because frankly, we are very lucky to be where we are. Another impact of some of these wars, many of these warlords have to fund these battles. Sorry, I had to pause for an announcement over the intercom there. Another impact we saw was these warlords have to fund their fighting, and one way they do it is through resources available in the ground. And Africa has the largest supply of diamonds in the world. About 2/3 of all global diamonds come from Africa, and many of them are being mined in these war-torn countries. Many of them are using slaves to mine them, and then those diamonds are being sold to fund the wars that are being fought. So it's a cycle. So I know when I proposed to my wife, when I bought the ring, I asked about this with the company, and I made them prove the source of origin for that diamond, where it came from, because many of these blood diamonds do end up in legitimate businesses throughout the world. And I was very impressed, actually, with the literature they had available on where that diamond had come from and how they had not utilized any blood diamonds throughout the world. I just thought that was a very interesting point. Probably not a question they get asked too often. They probably don't like history teachers coming into their business. Another fourth impact of this independence movement that took place in Africa is polarization, ethnic groups. Like I said, there are over 10,000 languages that are spoken in Africa, and many of these groups were forced together because of European colonization, and often formed bitter rivalries that once the Europeans left, spilled over into violence. So let's look at three of those very quickly. Nigeria. There were over 250 different ethnic groups within Nigeria, and after they became independent in 1960, all of them were vying for power. There have been 7 coups, revolutions that have taken place in Nigeria. So, that instability, again, how can you expect a nation to bring in, business or, bring in money from trade if there are coups taking place every other year? That instability leads to poverty. So we see that in Nigeria. Another example here, Kenya, another heavy different ethnic groups. In this one, the 2 major ethnic groups form the 2 main political parties in Kenya. And what we've seen over the last few decades is whichever group is in charge at the time will often lead violent assaults against the other. And it's just gone back and forth, just revenge and revenge. Hundreds of thousands of people displaced from their homes. One of the more recent, and frankly, this spilled over into genocide, where an ethnic group was targeted for complete removal. Okay, we always think of the Holocaust, and rightfully so. But this took place in Sudan. Sudan's a huge country. In the north, you have Arab citizens, and in the south, you have the black Sudanese population. And basically, they have kind of been at war with one another. When oil was discovered in the south, the Arab Sudanese basically tried to run out all the black Sudanese in the south, and they had just tried to massacre them. And we're talking thousands upon thousands of people that have been killed. Pretty terrible way to end this section of the notes, but sadly there has been a lot of violence and terror over the last few decades as a result of this. So we'll pause right here, and I hope you guys enjoyed today's lecture, found a few items of interest that you would like to dig into a little bit deeper in the future. As always, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Just either leave a comment on the video or shoot me an email, and I'll be happy to get back to you. Thanks.